Greetings, everyone, and welcome to this discussion of processing and giving some historical perspective to the experiences and lessons of the last year. My name is Marcia Eli, and I'm the Director of Programs at the Center for Brooklyn History, which is part of the Brooklyn Public Library. Recently, the center opened a new exhibition on the outside of our building on Clinton and Pierpont Streets, which is called Brooklyn Resists. It's one part of a much bigger public history project that explores the long history of racial injustice in Brooklyn and the equally long history of Black-led protest and resistance. This program is one of many connected to the themes of Brooklyn Resists and programs that are going to be offered throughout the summer and into the fall and even into the winter. I am very proud that tonight's program is a collaboration with the arm of Brooklyn Public Library that's called Justice Initiatives, a small but mighty team. Justice Initiatives is part of BPL's Outreach Services Department and works to support incarcerated and formerly incarcerated patrons and their families, and to raise public awareness of issues of racial, social, and economic justice. It's really been wonderful to work together to craft a panel that explores a year when we were all both profoundly isolated from one another and profoundly coming together for one another. And I'm really excited to hear what the folks behind their mutes and video off curtain here have to say. Before I introduce our moderator, I have two quick notes. First, I want to mention that one of tonight's guests, Johanna Fernandez, has a widely acclaimed award-winning book titled The Young Lords, A Radical History. And you may be interested in exploring and perhaps buying it as you listen tonight. To make that a simple click for you, we'll be putting in the chat a link to a webpage at the local community bookstore here in Brooklyn, or you can check it out from the library. I also want to invite you to share your questions tonight. If you're watching on Zoom, type them into the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. If you're watching on YouTube, type them into the chat. So now it is my pleasure to tell you a little bit about Kayla Lacy, who's tonight's moderator. Kayla is a politics reporter at The Intercept. She has also worked at Politico, covering breaking news and immigration and producing their flagship newsletter, Playbook. Prior to that, she worked in international reporting at the Pulitzer Center. It's an honor to have her. It's an honor to have all of the panelists tonight. Thank you all so much for being here. And Kayla, I hand it off to you.
Thank you so much, Marcia, and thank you all for joining us tonight. I am really excited to be here, and I have the honor of being in conversation with three people whose work I have long admired, who I will introduce you all to now. First, Johanna Fernandez is the author of The Young Lords, A Radical History, as Marcia just mentioned, a history of the Puerto Rican counterpart of the Black Panther Party. She teaches 20th century US history and the history of social movements at Baruch College. Her recent research and FOIL litigation against the NYPD led to the recovery of the lost Hanshu files, the largest repository of police surveillance records in the country, including more than 1 million surveillance files of New Yorkers compiled by the NYPD between 1954 and 1972, including those of Malcolm X. Johanna is the editor of Writing on the Wall, Selected Prison Writings of Mumia Abu Jamal. With Mumia Abu Jamal, she has co-edited a special issue of the journal Socialism and Democracy titled The Roots of Mass Incarceration in the US, Locking Up Black Dissidents and Punishing the Poor. Thank you, Johanna, for being here with us. Next is Zanat Begum, a native New Yorker, owner of Playground Coffee Shop, founder of Playground Youth, and an alumni of the New School. Zanat intentionally seeks to center BIPOC marginalized bodies, the arts, and community engagement in order to foster change in a shape-shifting and gentrifying Bed-Stuy. And finally, we have Senator Jafari Brisport, who represents New York's 25th State Senate District and is a third-generation Caribbean American from Brooklyn. He first became involved in political activism through the fight for marriage equality and the early Black Lives Matter movement, until becoming the first LGBTQ plus person of color to serve in New York's legislature this past January. He was a math teacher at a public middle school in Crown Heights. So Johanna, Zanat, and Senator Brisport, thank you all for being here with us tonight. So it has been a crazy couple of days. It has been a crazy year. And I just want to start with a broad question that you guys will probably hate me for, but what has the last year and even the last couple of weeks taught us about community safety, policing, and politics? And first, I'll start with Zanat.
Okay. This year has been so, it's kind of like a burning house, you know, and we talk about this analogy a lot in like the nonprofit world, which is what Playground Youth is. It's a 501c3 nonprofit that serves Bed-Stuy in the greater area, and thinking about the ways that like we can catch vulnerable communities before they fall, right? There aren't enough legislative actions that serve immigrants that live in New York, and we're realizing that through the services that are not readily available to them. And when we think about the conversations of who gets these resources, we have to think about immigrants as well. I'm a first-generation immigrant of this country, and I think about all the things and the hurdles that my parents had to get through just to get their basic needs met. And so I'm always advocating for trying to have more legislative change within policing, within also education and the arts, just because I'm from here and I want to see this city be the best it can be, because it has the resources to, but there's just a lot of misallocation of it.
Thank you, Zanat. Johanna or Senator Brisport, whoever wants to try next.
Can you repeat the question?
Of course, yeah. What has the last year taught us about community safety, policing, and politics?
Well, we've learned that we keep us safe. We've learned that social movements change history. And let me give you a sense of what I mean by that, although we all know, right? It was very possible, we learned, that Donald Trump would likely be a second-term president, given that it was a very close race. And unfortunately, the alternative was not capturing the imagination of people looking for an alternative in the United States. But the uprising of close to 35 million people shifted the terms of the debate in America on all kinds of different issues, mobilized the electorate, and ensured victory for the Democratic Party. Without the uprising of 35 million people, led definitely by the macabre character of the government's response to the pandemic, but also by Black resistance. And we know that the riot in American history rings the alarm bell, the Black riot in American society, and police brutality and the terror of it when seen as we saw it, really puts a mirror to the face of American democracy and has the potential to call on America's moral soul. That's what happened. And millions of people took the streets. Had that not happened, Trump would be governing this country today. So movements truly change history because they shift the terms of debate and they give people a sense that they can take the reins of history in their hands. We learned a lot about the police through political education, and unclear how that happens. But again, social movements are very dynamic. They have a way of shifting political debate and discussion. But what we know, and what more people know in American society today, is that the police emerges in American society as an institution charged with returning escaped enslaved Africans back to the plantation. We know that. Many people did not. More people need to know that. That's incontrovertible. And so when you know that, that gives you a sense about the racist character of the police. Racism, white supremacist violence is in the very DNA of this institution. We also learned that American medicine is essentially organized around private medicine, and it cannot, therefore, address public health needs. And we were told this by the CDC. The doctor, what's the name of the doctor?
Dr. Fauci.
Fauci. Early on, Dr. Fauci was cross-examined in Congress. And he was asked, well, you know, what are we going to do about testing? Because we need to test the population. And he said, yes, I agree. We need to test the population, but American medical care is not set up to test people. It's just not possible. From the horse's mouth.
Right. Senator Brisport, I want to put this question to you too, but I also want to add the context that given what Zanat and Johanna have just said, we're talking about, a year out, looking at, coming from your perspective in the legislature as well. I'm curious, looking at, what the year has taught us, and has that translated into what you're seeing being done in Albany, or I guess virtually up until a certain point recently. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, thanks for having me and putting me on, giving me a chance to be on this panel. I want to echo something that Johanna said just at the top when she said, we keep us safe. Specifically because I think one thing that I want to say some of us have learned over the past year is that when we do see rises in violence in certain communities that is independent of whether the police are funded, defunded, that conversation, and more so on whether or not communities have the ability to keep themselves stable. So like when we say we keep us safe, we can only keep ourselves safe as well as much as we are empowered with the resources we have to ensure that our communities, everyone has access to housing, to healthcare, to jobs, to solid education, to the things which make communities whole and stable. And the reason I say it's something that some of us have learned is because what I've also seen in the past year is right-wing commentators or right-wing forces pushing really hard the narrative that violence has increased in communities because the police have been defunded, which they were not in any meaningful way last year, or pushing the narrative that because there isn't a spike in gun violence, that we need more police. And we were actually seeing, well, the currently, I guess, leading mayoral candidate, a former cop, push the narrative that communities want more policing. They don't want to defund it. That's the thing they want. And it's troubling that that narrative is becoming has grown so popular so quickly, and something we need to fight against when, again, the police were not defunded in any meaningful capacity, and we saw violence spike regardless because people were out of jobs and worried about rent and were food insecure, the things that make communities unstable. So in terms of what I've seen, I also want to just piggyback on something else Johanna said, which was about movements and how effective they are. And I did notice a big difference in the city council budget vote. For those who don't know, the NYPD's budget, police budgets are controlled at the municipal level. And you can see a very clear difference in the votes last year versus this year. For those who don't know, the city council just voted on their budget today. And there was a much more of a movement pressure on city council to vote against increasing money for the police last year, or vote no on the budget because it didn't defund significantly last year than there was this year. And there are in fact city council members who voted no on the budget last year, saying, police, concerns, but then voted yes on this year's budget, even though there was an increase this year in money for police. And that's not to put the blame on activist or movement. Like it's not the job, it's not anyone on the street's responsibility to hold politicians accountable. It's expected that we have spines and that we do the right thing even when no one's watching. But what we've also learned is that there does need to be consistent grassroots pressure from the outside if we are going to keep pushing this narrative that we keep us safe and that we need to find alternatives to community safety that are not with the police.
Thank you for mentioning that city council vote. I think it's really important to note that, and to also note that it was, again, increasing the budget. And I also just want to point out to something that you said about the narratives being pushed with respect to the mayoral race. Obviously, we're still waiting for the next round of votes to come in, and I don't want to give too much time to this because for a lot of reasons, but that narrative is being pushed there's a narrative being pushed that New Yorkers want a pro-cop mayor because of the initial results that are coming in, right? There's a narrative being pushed that New Yorkers they don't want police reform, they don't want any of these things. And I'm not saying that that's right at all. I'm agreeing with your point that I think it's part of this co-optation that we're seeing, driven by a lot of conversation, online, and not what's actually going on in people's communities, but about this idea that somehow voting for Eric Adams or voting for Maya Wiley or voting for Catherine Garcia means that people don't want, X, Y, and Z about police reform, when we know that these demands have been coming from these communities for centuries. So just a little segue there. I want to ask you each what you think people's most common misconceptions about these things are, particularly policing, and the idea that increasing policing translates to community safety, and sort of debunking some of that more. And anyone can take this question.
I can start just with my experience in Bed-Stuy, and I'm actually happy I have the opportunity to share this because I remember being, I think, on a panel with the Brooklyn Public Library about a year ago, talking about a similar topic. And in that time, something really tragic happened in Bed-Stuy, where there was a shootout and a 1-year-old was the victim of a stray bullet. Extremely tragic. And the community response was to put up a police detail, basically 2 cops and their car stationed at the exact site of where the 1-year-old was murdered. And they were there for weeks, I want to say months afterwards. And, that's a common thing you see sometimes. People want an immediate quick fix solution and they immediately go towards cops. But even while those cops were stationed right there, about 2 months later, about a block away, there was another fatal shooting. And people from the community reached out to me saying, okay, well, can we get police there? Can we get a police camera there? And I had to pause and say that this is not something we can play whack-a-mole with, where every time there's a shooting, you put cops stationed there, because that's clearly not addressing the root cause of the situation. It's not even addressing the situation. I mean, if cops are stationed and half a block or block away, there's a fatal shooting, then what exactly are they preventing? So I say this with acknowledging the tragedy that is happening in our communities, but really pushing forward the notion that we need to find solutions that I think proactive rather than reactive, and really talk about what safety actually looks like, and get people away from the knee-jerk reaction that safety comes from a person with a badge and a gun posted in a specific place.
I'll follow up on this. I think that's a pretty incisive example you offer, Jafari, because the statistic is that a cop will apprehend a crime in progress once every 200 years, literally. Like, this is what the criminologists say. It's a joke. So if cops are not there or cannot statistically prevent crime as it's happening, why are they there? What do they do? What function do they serve in society? Well, in a society that's as unequal as ours, across the world, in fact, class inequality is rising. There has to be a force that's going to keep the conflict and conflicts that are going to emerge out of that inequality down. And so part of what we learned over the course of the last year was the role of the police. The police was unleashed against protesters in New York City. I mean, police drove over protesters in New York, Mr. Council person. What are we doing about that? Like, literally. And they were out in force, militarized to contain resistance. A disproportionate number of cops are called to answer medical health problems, like mental health crises. The statistics are quite, it's like it's 40%. 40% of what cops do is respond to health and mental health crises across the city, but especially in poor communities of color. The cops have expanded their power and influence in every organization in society. They're in hospitals. You go to Lincoln Hospital, you go to Jacoby, and there is a police department in the hospital. They're in our schools, they're in our communities and in our streets. What kind of society relies on brute force and guns, albeit guns provided by the state, to solve social problems? I mean, it doesn't make any sense, really. And I say this because the pandemic kind of woke everybody up. Like, oh, they can give us a check. What is it called? They can give us a check for how much?
The stimulus.
The stimulus package. They can give us a stimulus check. And they can give the Wall Street cats $3 billion at the drop of a hat. So clearly the problem is not one of resources, but one of priorities. And so the fact that the pandemic has reorganized society by force has suggested to many that things don't have to be the way they've been. That actually, at the drop of a dime, we could shift course and prioritize perhaps human need. So now that we're questioning what the government can and cannot do, shouldn't we question why it is that our society answers questions and offers solutions to social problems with the Billy Club? I mean, it's uncivilized. It's insane. We need less alienated communities. We need more jobs and better schools and social workers, people who are trained ethically and humanistically to address conflict in our communities. And it can't be an invading force. It has to be people in the community being trained to address conflict as it emerges.
And you set up a good segue to talk about both your work with the young lords, and I want to draw some parallels between that and what Zanat has been doing with Playground Coffee Shop and Playground Youth. And I mean, I'll start with you, Zanat. I mean, the work of that you're doing, in many ways is sort of, at least in my mind, the ideal version of what I think about when I think about alternatives to policing and the ways that communities keep each other safe. But you've been doing this since way before the pandemic started. And I want to ask you a little bit about that and how that work has evolved over the last year and why it's so crucial. Yeah.
First of all, let me say happy Pride. We still have one more day left. So, and speaking of Pride, Washington Square Park, like a few days ago, was raided by the cops. My friends who were in that pool of water, I won't disclaim their names, but in any case, why is a celebration being met with like brute force? As Johanna, you're saying, it's so amazing in which like what we're allowed to use to defend ourselves and what cops are allowed to use to defend themselves, you know, we're not the same. Like arrows to like bullets are not the same. And it goes back to like, you know, just like the inception of this country and how land takeover and land acquisition exists. It's very, very violent. And like we can eradicate and completely cause the erasure of a whole race just to cover up the country's historical foundation. It's, you know, conceptually, it's racist, it's homophobic, it's xenophobic, it's all those kinds of things. But at the end of the day, when you're trying to, like the current mayoral candidate that's like in the lead right now wants to have a cop in every train station. Can you imagine what those lines are going to look like for stop and frisk? There are kids who get stopped. There, myself get included. After post 9/11, I was getting stopped to go to middle school just because I had a hijab on. And these cops are becoming cops within 6 to 9 weeks. And maybe that is a hyperbolized time frame that I'm expressing, but if you get what I'm saying is like, you know, they say like, you know, as a joke, like it takes longer to become a hairdresser or like a nail technician, you know what I'm saying? And in those same nuances that Johanna is explaining and even Jafari, you guys are explaining things that are like such as mental health crises and also abusive relationships. During this pandemic, abuse in households have increased. Women cannot leave their homes. I was watching this not watching, so I was listening to a podcast about this woman who was expressing that she was in an abusive household in her Zoom call. She was trying to use these signs to kind of be as discreet as possible while her abuser is walking behind her. You know, these are ways that like we have to be aware to like how to take care of these kinds of people. Do we have social workers showing up to sites where there's a domestic violence call? No, it's usually a cop. You know, if people are being killed in the middle of their sleep, is there something that we can even do? Are we at an even sort of having a defense, you know? And that's why Playground was created, because we have no option. And once we actually, you know, started our business 3 or 4 days before Trump got elected into office, that weekend, there was like this huge march that was happening in Washington, DC. I was noticing the influx of white people, you know, going into their Subaru hatchbacks and making their way down to DC, you know, with their huge posters that say feminism and power to the people. And for me, working behind the bar, trying to create this space that Playground is in, I have to advocate for the spaces that I'm in, and I can't leave. And as a New Yorker, I'm dedicated to my neighborhood and to making sure that we have resources. And that's why we started a community fridge. This community fridge program popped off and had a worldwide impact. There's a fridge in Fiji, which is so bizarre to think about. But, you know, like this is what it is. It's like grassroots organizing that shape shifts larger movements. And we're talking about bodies of people coming together during the streets, into the streets during the height of a pandemic. People, and the common misconception, as to answer your last question, is that people thought that protesters were getting COVID from protesting. Well, there were anti-mask rallies happening in conjunction with these, you know, we are not the same. I cannot promote that. And when we had the opportunity to open the space back up and with very limited resources, we called to action, and we had about 20,000 PPE kits made for protesters that were hitting the streets every day for 60 days, 5 protests a day, you know, and that's impact. That's what it means to get on the ground and actually distribute resources. and we weren't waiting for anyone. You know, if you are going to have police scanners, cool. I'm going to download the app and try to figure out where the cops are coming and what street they're going down so that my friends are going to be okay when we're protesting. And these are the same things that these, you know, everybody has access to, and using them to kind of manipulate how we can keep ourselves safe. And that's why Playground is so integral to how we keep us safe, because we've offered alternative resources to when people cannot actually take care of themselves. And whether people can articulate or express those things is, you know, beyond my comprehension. But I would hate for people to get into a vulnerable position and feel like they have nowhere to go, you know. And unfortunately, of course, government agencies should show up. That's what's expected, right? But we live in America where there's very racially charged movements that give certain people rights over other people because of the way you look and how much power and money you hold. If you're getting a $3 billion bailout versus a $1,400 stimulus check, I don't know what to tell you. You're probably not affected by the pandemic, you know? And that's the thing, that is that all of us were hugely affected by the pandemic, and we lived through this. And that's why, you know, telling our stories is so important through the work that we do, because there is constant erasure of who we are. But even creating our own forms of policing, and what I mean anti-policing, is so important, because we have to be able to take care of ourselves before we enter a space where there is less police presence, because a lot of people are not ready for that, which is, it's hard to digest, but we're going to have to make that transition if this is actively what we want in our communities, you know?
Can I ask Sanat to outline exactly the contours of your project? You talked about it, but it sounds amazing.
Yes, please do. Please do.
Okay, cool. So I opened it in 2016. It was it was my dad's hardware store for 20 years. And his business failed because Home Depot opened up the same year as his last year being open. So in lieu of that, we were able to, get the space kind of flipped around, and I poured a lot of my own personal projects and personal favors to make this happen, because as a 22-year-old, you don't have money. So, you use the resources you can, and you build a place, and, they say if you build it, they will come. And they did. So 5 years later now, we have a nonprofit in which we do programming under, this is through art fairs, community dinners. We are also doing just all around trades and skills courses. Like we do a barista training because we are a coffee shop. We've trained over 200 people in our program. We also do financial literacy courses. We've done a bunch of defense training and bystander training through iHollaback, which has been a great resource during this time. But, we do an array of programming through this nonprofit, and we're able to kind of, keep our community sustainable through the coffee shop. And during the pandemic, while we didn't have the store open, there were still a lot of people who wanted to activate the space in a different way. And I felt like if you guys couldn't congregate inside, we bring everything outside. So we put a community library outside. It's a take one, leave one, and they're all intentional titles that we stock. We also have a greenhouse that is growing food right now to fill our fridges, which we have 4 of, where there's one here, there's one outside of Sincerely Tommy, which is another coffee shop in the neighborhood, Beauty Strike, which is a Black-owned business in Fort Greene, as well as Hair Metal, which is in Williamsburg. And all of these fridges are 24/7 accessible. And there's a huge network that is able to help make sure these mechanisms run really well. And so we have a vast team here, and I'm so lucky to be able to work with us every day, just because we're very devoted and we live in these communities that we are servicing in too. So if you ever have the time, please come down. Let's get a coffee. Jafari, you too, and Kayla, you too. Well, honestly, everybody on this call, TBH.
I walked by it on the other day for the first time, and I was like, yes, made a mental note that I need to come.
Oh my God, say hi.
Yeah. Thank you for explaining that, Zanat. And it's a bright spot to hear you talk about this stuff, because so much of what we talk about is really sad and gloomy, and it's so I'm just want to note that. So you said something that stuck with me about erasure, and I keep thinking about this because in preparing for this and just thinking about my sort of political education and awakening, and seeing people sort of throw around the concept of mutual aid in the last, year to 6 months as something that is new or didn't exist. And again, we know that our communities and our people have been supporting each other this way for forever, like since we've been here. And so Johanna, I want to ask you to talk a little bit about the specific history of mutual aid in Brooklyn and how the idea of groups like the idea of how mutual aid manifested inside groups like the Young Lords and the Black Panthers have carried into the work of organizers today.
Well, first of all, human beings are social animals. We can't survive individually on our own. So for the better part of human history, people have survived through collective action and collaboration. Through circles, indigenous people had a very communal way of living, and that's how they survived. And that's how immigrants survive. So immigrants, this is the nation of immigrants. That's how enslaved Africans survived. And so mutual aid is a long-standing tradition dating back to the beginning of humanity, before the rise of class society and capitalism, which reorganized society not around human need and collaboration, but around competition, cutthroat competition and profit. The Young Lords and the Black Panthers initiated what they called survival programs. The current children's breakfast program, as we all know, emerges because it was initiated by the Black Panthers on the basis that hungry children are not going to learn in school, and children in disproportionately Black and Puerto Rican neighborhoods of New York and other Latino neighborhoods are poor because of racism, and their exclusion from the professions, from decent paying jobs, from unions. So this was an idea that emerged. The Young Lords and the Black Panthers were anti-capitalist. So their logic was, first of all, we need to meet the needs of our community. We need to commit ourselves to what our communities need. But these programs will help our community see that we keep us safe and that we are able to meet needs that the government should meet but doesn't. So it's amazing, as I was listening to Sanat, to see the immense creativity and the resources and possibilities and excitement that emerge when people are working together for a higher purpose and a higher good. There's a tremendous amount of pride, right, and purpose that then grows within people, and these efforts snowball, and more people want to chime in, and they give us a sense of possibility and of what can be. The problem with mutual aid is that the need is so great that the efforts of individuals with limited resources often can only provide so much, far below what we actually need.
Thank you, Johanna. Talking about sort of these anti-capitalist groups, I want to shift to you, Senator Brisport, and talking about I don't know if I want to call it the wave, but the election, your election, was historic for a number of reasons, but for part of that is that you were one of the sort of socialist aligned members who are now in Albany. And we're seeing this happen in cities across the country. Buffalo just elected a socialist as its a Democratic nominee for mayor. I want to ask you, from your perspective, what has it been like trying to translate that movement into your role, and I wonder if you can talk about some of the frustrations that you have had, just having your election at such a turbulent time, and then also serving your first term at an equally turbulent time, and coming from that perspective.
Yeah, of course. I would say I was part of a socialist cadre that got elected into the state legislature last summer. I think more and more frequently and more people are fed up with capitalism. I mean, we're living through a new Gilded Age where the rich are getting richer while the poor are getting poorer. And in the case of last year, they're not just getting poor, they're dying from lack of access to medical care, or worried about their food insecure, or they're dying at the hands of state violence. All those wrapped into one. So I would say my biggest role in pushing against the grain earlier this year when I entered the legislature with other socialists was fights over the budget, which I think are not the sexiest piece of legislation, but definitely the most impactful thing that legislative bodies vote on. And we mounted a massive tax the rich campaign to fund social services. And we had major fights with other legislators and leadership about, how much we thought we could raise. And we had, bills proposed to raise approximately $50 billion in new revenue. And ultimately, by the time we passed it, it got whittled down to around 4 or 5. But we are going to come back and do it again because we want to radically imagine what's possible. And, 50 billion sounds like a lot of money. You say these numbers, they sound like so much, but, a lot of the framing we talked about was class struggle, which is what socialists love to talk about, and acknowledging that during the pandemic last year, when most people were under the impression that everyone was suffering and everyone they know was losing people or losing their job or worried about rent, in the midst of all of that, the elite, the billionaires of New York, actually saw their net worth increase by tens of billions of dollars in the matter of months. And the fact that that was happening while so many of our neighbors were losing their jobs or losing their lives, or losing their livelihoods was unconscionable to so many of us. And I had to sit and debate some of my colleagues about, when we say tax the rich, who's considered rich. And not to get into too much of the wonkiness, because you start saying too many numbers and people get bored and tune out, but we were pushing to raise taxes on people making over $300,000, which to me is rich. That's a lot. When I was a public school teacher, I made $65,000, and anybody, if you're making 5 times as much as a public school teacher, you're not working at 5 times as hard as a public school teacher. Anyway, I think that's a lot of money. But there were some that were like $1 million, that's where we should start, and some that said $2 million, that's where we should start, which are just obscene amounts of money. And we ended up, the compromise was at $1 million, which is just, that's so much high. And there are people who are making $300,000, $500,000 a year who can afford to pay more and should be paying more. And the realm of possibility for what you can pay for once you start doing that, deeper investments in mental health care, in housing, in jobs programs, in just physical infrastructure, the things that, again, go back to what we were talking about at the beginning, that make communities more stable and able to keep themselves safe. The realm of possibilities you open up when you actually do invest in those is just astronomical. So that's a big part of the fight that we're going to keep carrying on in the future, which is just redistribution of wealth from those who can afford to pay more to those who really, really need more. And with the movement growing every year, I'm excited about what we're going. We have some, I know things are still being finalized on the elections for New York City, just New York City in general, but I'm confident there will be some socialists elected to the city council. I'm excited for the work that they'll be doing in the budget battle at the city council level next year. And, let's make budgets sexy, because they are.
Yes, I'm all for making budgets sexy. I think budgets are sexy. There's a lot to work with there. Thank you, Senator Brisport. So I want to shift gears a little bit and talk about how, I mean, this is all sort of underlying what we've been talking about in terms of communities and safety and policing, but something that I report a lot on and that has gotten a lot of attention during the pandemic is the state of the prison industrial complex in the US, and how incarcerated people have been impacted by this pandemic. And we've seen, some successes of the movement for decarceration in terms of early release or compassionate release for people, release of people, waiting, awaiting pre-trial, waiting to pay cash bail. I want to ask how you all see the work of formerly and currently incarcerated people informing sort of these projects around mutual aid and caring for community. And I can direct this for now. This is open to all of you, but I'll direct it to Johanna just to ask about your work with Mumia, who is still behind bars and for whom there is a growing there are growing calls to have him be part of this sort of compassionate release as a result of the pandemic, but we know that's not moving at the moment. So yeah.
What is the question again? Sorry.
Yeah, how formerly and currently incarcerated people have sort of informed, our understanding of these projects around mutual aid and caring for community, and just any other insights you might have on how incarcerated people have been impacted or lifted up during the pandemic.
Well, I think that people who have been incarcerated and are released, many people, I mean, it's hard to say because the United States incarcerates such a large percentage of its population that all kinds of people are in prison. We can't really keep track of those who come out, right? But there are plenty of prisoners who were active in prison and who were yearning to join social movements upon their release. But prisoners also experience tremendous alienation, crises, economic and otherwise, because it's hard to get a job in the United States if you have a criminal record or if you've been imprisoned. But I know of the African Black Panther Party, radical organization that emerged in prison. They're doing a lot of mutual aid work in New Jersey, in Newark, in fact. They met with the mayor, who's funneling resources to the organization, which is then being redistributed by these former prisoners. I think we didn't see enough resistance and protest against what became death houses during the pandemic. We don't know how many prisoners were infected and died of COVID-19, but prisons are teeming with people. There's no possibility of social distancing. The conditions under which people suffered and died of COVID-19 in American prisons is a horror show. I don't know what else to say other than that beginning in the 1980s, American social policy was literally organized around crime and immigration. Whenever you turned on the television, the political debate was around crime and immigration. And all of our laws were pretty much organized around this and tax cuts for the rich. And Black people and immigrants became the scapegoats in America at a moment when the United States was experiencing a massive transfer of wealth from the bottom of society to the top. The working class was eviscerated during the last 40 to 50 years. Wages have remained stagnant. In some cases, they've gone down. Healthcare, which we used to get through our employers, was pretty much taken away. And while this mass transfer of wealth from the bottom of society to the top was happening, most Americans were busy, distracted, thinking that the problem in society was crime and immigration. So these were the scapegoats, right? A society that's this deeply unequal needs scapegoats. And in many ways, this mass turn to incarceration and the policing of America. New York has the second largest standing army in the world in the form of the police. This is the precursor to the neo-fascist crisis we saw not long ago that is still with us. So prisons are the most unfree site in society, and America has plenty of them. In fact, the carceral state is the third largest employer in the country. So this gives you a sense of the crisis that this country is facing, which cannot be fixed with legislation. Like, this is structural. We stopped making cars and started building prisons as a country. That is what American capitalism means. And that is part of what can help us understand the depth of the crisis that brought us the neo-fascism of January 6th and Trump and the kids, the Nazi kids who dismembered or desecrated the statue of George Floyd in Brooklyn just a week ago. We're talking about a deep crisis that is here for a while. And so the question is, where do we go from here? I definitely think that, and I'll end by saying that prisoners need to be at the center of our movements and our discussions, because when people hear prisoners speak, their humanity is manifest. And part of what our government has gotten away with is demonizing ordinary people, right? Prisoners. We tend to think of them as a society as evil incarnate, but they're ordinary people, and they need to speak for themselves so that that humanity can be returned to them.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Thank you for that. And you said, you mentioned the scapegoats of crime and immigration. And I mean, just we're seeing it, the same exact thing is happening as we speak. I mean, we just saw, National Guard troops are being deployed to the border to address some sort of manufactured crisis that is being sort of peddled. And that just makes me think sort of about where we go from here, right? How do we, and you just said this also, Johanna, but how we communicate these things to people who might not be of the same political leanings as us, or who may be, I know that there is a whole sector of people who don't approach these things in good faith. So I'm not talking about that necessarily, but I'm talking about people who might actually don't have the context to understand some of these things, or some of the things that we're talking about, and are reacting from a very human place of fear. And so I want to ask all of you, in doing the work that you do, both as a scholar, as an organizer, and as an elected official, what have been the most effective and ineffective tactics for you in bridging that gap with people? And I'll start with you, Senator Brisport.
I think one way that we've been effective at this in the state legislature is that we've gotten a group of legislators who have been pretty strong against the creation of new crimes and the expansion of the carceral state. I mean, one thing I've definitely, I think, voted no on every time is the increasing of felony penalties for certain things where, it's already a crime. You already get, 1, 2, 3 years, and the bill would expand to 5, 10 years just on the premise. It's like, what's it making this a felony solve in the first place? If it's not working, I mean, there's nobody that's out there thinking, I'll commit this crime if I can get out of prison in 5 years, but 10 years, then I definitely won't do it. That's a flawed understanding of why people engage in behavior that is harmful or violent in the first place. So there's been pushback on that, and I've pushed back on a lot of these bills, and so we do a lot of that, and then what we have been doing is a lot of, outreach and work with advocates on legislation that decreases the carceral state. So in terms of the condition for incarcerated people, we passed legislation that would drastically reduce solitary confinement. For those who don't know, solitary confinement is, well, one, it's awful, but it's actually been deemed torture by the United Nations if it's longer than 15 days. So we passed halt solitary to switch, confine it to 15 days or less. And then there were several pieces of legislation there. I'm actually very frustrated, never got pushed to a vote, but there was legislation colloquially known as elder parole, which would say, when an incarcerated person reaches the age of 55 years old, they should be automatically considered for parole. At that point, what harm are they to society at large? And just speaking from my own personal experience, I had the chance to visit a prison called Fishkill. As an elected official, I can go visit, prisons, jails without warning and go tour around. So I toured around and I saw one of their units for people with cognitive issues or mental impairments. And there were older people there that, one guy, he wasn't even talking. And I talked to the corrections officer, like, is everything okay? And they were like, yeah, some days he talks, some days he doesn't. There was like somebody, they talked to me about an incarcerated man there who was like, his dementia was so bad, he didn't recognize his own reflection in the mirror, which, that if you can't recognize your own reflection, you probably also don't know why you're even in prison. So there's elder parole, which did not, we did not pass it this year, but we'll be pushing for it next year. And then there was another one called Clean Slate. And that's about incarceration, but not necessarily the prisons themselves, but the whole thing that happens to you after you've been locked up. Your record just follows you. And for millions of New Yorkers, actually, that record sticks with them, and maybe it affects their ability to get jobs or XYZ. So expunging records for millions of New Yorkers was something we pushed and almost came to a vote, and there was a fatal flaw in the wording of it, and we couldn't get it done before the end of session in June. But we'll be pushing for that again.
Thank you, Senator Brisport. Zanat or Johanna, tactics that are most effective or ineffective in your respective work?
Okay, well, some tactics that work are, I think about all the things that we've kind of shed light on this year and how companies have showed up for like smaller businesses or grassroots organizations. It's about like being able to utilize the resources that you have adequately. And, the one thing that I realized that doesn't go well within mutual aid is fundraising aspect of it. You're, bombarding these accounts, these Venmos with like thousands of dollars, and then they have an accumulative wealth afterwards of like $1 million. There are many movements that have that much wealth that don't know how to distribute it, that don't actually know how to effectively plan and program. And I think that one of the most frustrating things that I've learned throughout this year is in grant writing and in research and trying to get funds for this coffee shop / community space / bookstore / so many different things / safe space that, enrages me, because when I'm trying to be very vulnerable about getting money from these institutions that have, these large amounts of money hanging over our head, and what will you do at what cost to be able to get these things? And when you're not awarded with such, it makes you kind of feel like you're defeated, and not having those funds kind of come to you makes you feel like you're doing something wrong. Why am I not being able to get the attention? And, considering that we don't have this like vast amount of money within our own communities, the one thing that I think that really did work is mutual aid. Using that same $20 and redistributing that within our communities, right? My friends who got a stimulus check would sometimes cash that whole stimulus check and give it to a nonprofit or give it to another organization, and that's what it is. It's putting your best foot forward with the resources you're given. But, considering that we only got 2 stimulus checks in the span of a pandemic, it's troublesome, because yes, when we do have large budgets to fund the police, to defund education, to also then take away all of, the biggest things that make New York the best place ever, which is like just being able to congregate in the same spaces, it puts you in a place of like desperation, and I want to be able to use what I have to make sure that my community is served, and we're thinking about how to go into a direction that is, what does it look like to not have the police? Do not have the police means there's no metal detectors in school. That means that every time kids who get detention, who then end up getting suspended, don't go to detention centers. That we actually try to rehabilitate these kids and not put them into the prison industrial complex. And then we think about the pipeline from also slavery to the prisons. It's like, it's a direct walk. It's a bridge, if anything. These people are opening the doors and letting these folks in for petty crimes, you know, where we want to decriminalize certain drugs to be able to release folks who are in prison right now, you know, and it's hard because you want to put a stay-at-home order when prisoners have been, people who are incarcerated have been in the same four walls, living the same experience that we've had for this last year for 30 plus odd years, sometimes even in solitary confinement. When I worked at Rikers in 2000, I want to say 15 to 17, these kids were not allowed to have anything, no hot water, none of that. And I understand when you take away these things from them, they become defenseless, right? But they go into severe desperation and being able to get these things. Sometimes they don't even have their families fulfilling their commissaries to get food, right? And so when my friends and I were using our pen pal project, which has now been really extensive, and we've worked with Black and Pink for the last few years in trying to get, you know, Christmas letters out to incarcerated folks who don't have families, and just being able to connect with them, is that like actually making sure that these people have money in their accounts, that the work that they're doing doesn't amount to 5 cents a day, you know? If you're going to put them in a situation in which they have to fight for their lives too and work for it, at least give them something to walk away with, you know? Like when people are let out of the prisons, they're generally walking away with the same outfit they walked in with, you know? Like we're not giving them opportunities, we're not setting them up. And that's the problem, is that like if we are trying to think about a world without police and abolition, we also have to create more space to actively go into schools and fund them in the ways that we want to, so that kids get all the resources to actually become social workers and all these things that we need. But no, we're actively funding the police and taking away from education. And it's hard because as a coffee shop, how do you address these issues? I'm not sure. But I used my brick and mortar for as much as I could to be able to expel a lot of the issues and talk it out with my community. Like the first day that we opened, you know, it's days leading up to the elections, and after the election, we held a community town hall in which 100 people showed up and just explained their grievances of what they wanted. And that's what it means to have accountability, to have people's voices heard. You know, I'm also a part of my CP3, so I go to these community board hearings. I'm a part of my block association. I'm listening to people. I'm thinking about the gaps in society that have been present for so long, not during the pandemic, even prior, and will probably exist afterwards, because there is no one that's going to keep us safe. And we think about safety. Policing is not safety. Policing is surveillance. Surveillance culture is very much ingrained with also, you know, controlling our every step. Like our phones are watching us. There's data on us that is probably living in the middle of the Midwest somewhere, and people are obsessed with crypto. It's like we're worrying about the wrong things, you know. And of course I'm rambling right now, but I think about the one thing I've really learned in the tactics at work is working within your communities to do what you can and making sure your neighbors are good, you know, and having those conversations, because we need to make sure these people hear themselves out, because sometimes we don't have a soundboard and not everybody has access to therapy and having mental health resources, but we have to be able to put forth this agenda that we have to take care of each other.
Thank you, Sanat. Johanna, I want to come back to you, but I want to be cognizant of time, when we do have some questions coming in. So I'll circle back to you because I do want to hear your answer.
Good. Questions.
First, to start off, how can we make moves to sustain mutual aid in New York City besides donating money? And I also, sorry, thank you to people who are sending in questions. Please send in more. And anyone who wants to take this one, have at it.
I can start with being that if, you know, aside from donating money, you can donate time. That, you know, mutual aid doesn't want to be like, you know, you pay for something that you give to someone. It could be skill sharing. It could be volunteering in some capacity. I mean, a lot of mutual aid is about building community together. And I think there is often, you know, people make the distinction, you know, mutual aid is not quite charity, right? So I think that's one distinction you can make, is that, you know, it's not necessarily, it's always great, right, if you're able to pay for somebody's groceries, and I think there's always going to be someone that needs that. But sometimes mutual aid is childcare, right? And if you're able to take on, you know, that time out of your day to help somebody, to look after their child so they can go to work or go to a doctor's appointment. That's helpful too. And I think I saw a lot of mutual aid networks that were arising during the pandemic, almost crushing the weight of just like time and logistics management, like being able to have money. And as I was saying this, earlier too, of some being able to like have, no problem raising money, but in terms of the distribution of it, or the distribution of resources, distribution of time, that being, an issue.
Thank you. Anyone else want to jump in on that one? So in that same vein, how do you differentiate between mutual aid groups and nonprofits? This is from the audience.
Well, nonprofits can collect money, they can get tax write-offs. There are many different ways that you can benefit from having a nonprofit. But the certification, however, is a rigorous task. You get to go through that experience. I personally went through a lot of difficulty, and but it's what kind of establishes us from being a mutual aid where people quite literally overlook you to being a nonprofit. But the nuances of nonprofits are almost as horrible as an exploitative, capital firm that's like trying to do the same thing. It's like underpaying people for doing the work that they do. But mutual aid is regular folks, people like you and I, rotating the same amount of resources that we have within each other, devoting our time, as Jafari has said, like being able to show for community organizations, like by working the lunch line, working something. And with nonprofits, I feel like, a lot of organizations that we've seen in the last year, specifically things like, and I'll talk about this very frankly, but things like the Sunrise Movement that have over $20 million in funding and don't actually do anything with it. And we're looking at people who have nonprofit statuses that can't even get the people who look like them to make sure things happen for the people who look like them, if you get what I'm saying. It's like advocating for people who are in positions of power. It's like they say, like, skin folk is not kin folk sometimes, but like, we're thinking about situations in which like people who look just like me right now in office, who've expressed many severe and horrifying tactics to get immigrants to not come to this country, to not letting folks to get the proper resources. But, it's just knowing that, like, I don't know, we're trying. I think we're trying.
Thank you. This one is specifically for Senator Brisport. Can Jafari say anything about the passage of marijuana legalization in New York and what legalization versus decriminalization means?
Sure. So we passed it, and it is currently legal to smoke it anywhere, to possess and smoke it anywhere you can smoke a cigarette. You can't sell it yet. Just that's logistical stuff. There are a series of licenses we put into legislation for selling and distributing it. And we have to back up about 5 steps because we need to create an office of cannabis management that will actually distribute the licenses, and we need to build that office, and we need to put people to actually work there and draft the license and grant them. So I think you'll probably start seeing your first weed stores in about a year to a year and a half from now. But, if you come across cannabis by any other means, I'm not endorsing any type of behavior on this call, but if you come across cannabis by any other means and you happen to possess it up to 3 ounces, you should be, that's legal, and you can smoke it in public. That's fine. And I also just asked about legalization for decriminalization.
Yeah, the difference between the two. Yeah.
Sure. Well, legalization is what it sounds like. I don't think I need to explain that, but decriminalization is for things that are technically not legal, but will not put you through the criminal system. An easy way to think about it is that jaywalking is technically not legal, but it's definitely decriminalized. You don't go to jail for jaywalking.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. So another one for Zanat. What is your hope for the future of Playground?
Cool. My hope for the future of Playground is to be able to do exactly what we do effectively with the amount of resources, funding, and staffing that we deserve. I think that, of course, last year was very difficult to navigate through and towards. I feel that because we were able to make it through such a difficult time, Playground has been really integral to Bed-Stuy, and I would wish for it to have a future that is fruitful for not only me, but the generation after mine, because I feel like within the legacy of family business that my family has had, and now going into my generation, I feel hopeful, because I know that I've amassed this amazing group of people to work at Playground and have the similar vision. And I know, even listening to Johanna, you speak tonight, it's so amazing to know that, like, you know, you're calling me inspiring. You're saying that you're shocked by the work that I do, but it's just like, I'm only a reflection of all the folks that came before me. And I want to honor that by just making sure places like Playground continue to exist, you know, sharing resources. And I want to sit down with other people who want to do similar initiatives like this in all over the country, because I know that, like, larger scale revolutions aren't just because of everybody moving together at once. It's smaller communities doing it individually in their own respective areas. And that's the only way we can do this, is if we attain to and focus to our communities, right? Because we can't save the world and change the world all at once. But I think in the smaller pockets that we are able to, I think just being able to invest in those communities is my biggest concern for the future. And, you know, the idea that they let me do this forever and ever.
Thank you. Questions for Johanna. How did you get involved in your line of research?
Oh, Lord Jesus. It's such, it's such a long story. I learned about the Young Lords in college randomly. I grew up in the Bronx. The Young Lords occupied Lincoln Hospital, and they were badass, eloquent, fierce, strategic revolutionaries who won radical reforms. And that just blew my mind when I was coming of age politically. So I decided to go to graduate school and not law school. And then I wrote a dissertation on the Young Lords. And it wasn't easy because 60s radicals are traumatized. They were persecuted by the FBI, as you know, the counterintelligence program. So they're walking around with big wounds and trauma. And so it took a minute to tell their story and to interview them and to get them to trust me. But this book is, it's an amazing piece of work. I put my heart and soul into it, and I missed the 10-year deadline. The story was too important for me to rush it to completion. And I wrote it like a movie. It's deeply grounded in research. And I'm really proud of it. And it's a story that people need to know. The Young Lords are hands down the most successful and most dynamic and most badass 60s organization, and no one really knows about them. So check out the book. And they're the Puerto Rican counterpart of the Black Panther Party.
Thank you.
The Patient Bill of Rights, by the way, was drafted by the Young Lords alongside doctors at Lincoln Hospital. The Patient Bill of Rights, the first no patient Bill of Rights, something we take for granted. And they organized a drug addiction clinic that used acupuncture in the treatment of those with substance addiction problems. And they were maligned for the use of acupuncture. And now this is the practice everywhere in the world.
Johanna, have you ever watched 80 Blocks from Tiffany's?
Have I watched?
80 Blocks from Tiffany's?
No.
It's a documentary from the 70s by this guy, Gary Weiss. But it's about these two gangs that take care of their communities. It's like, I think it's in the Bronx, but it's very amazing. It's the Savages versus the Skulls. I can't remember, but it's amazing. You should watch it.
I will. Gary Weiss.
Gary Weiss.
I was just writing that down. Sorry, one other question for Johanna. How can we currently support Mumia Abu Jamal while he's still inside?
Well, there is an action in Philadelphia on July 3rd at 2 p.m. We're in the streets. You can contact me at jfernandez1202@gmail. You can show a movie. There's a blackout on the case of Mumia Abu Jamal, and there are plenty of incredible movies on the case. I actually made one of them titled Justice on Trial, the Case of Mumia Jamal, which is a movie for this moment because it really addresses the role of the police in the case. And we literally talk to the police. You can show a movie in your school, at your workplace, to raise the profile of the case in your community. And you can join one of the many organizations that's trying to free him. So there's the campaign to bring Mumia home, of which I'm a part. Or you can just sponsor someone to come to your community to speak about the case, like me. I mean, sponsor, just invite me. That's what that means. Or Pam Africa, or plenty others. That's a beginning.
Thank you. So I have a couple of other questions here. It looks like these are both directed at Senator Brisport. So one question, I'm going to sort of try to paraphrase this. I'm not sure if this is exactly what this person is getting at, but do state representatives and senators have structured or regular efforts in place to understand issues and difficulties around policing? So I guess, are there, I don't know, is there like a policing caucus that you guys are working on, or like what, like, are there, yeah, I guess they're asking if there are sort of structured ways in which people in your position or in the legislature are sort of addressing issues around policing, whether that's through conversation or legislation.
Yeah, I think I can answer that. There's a few things. Well, one, I do want to say that policing and police budgets are handled at the municipal level, not the state. But I'm not to pass the buck, just to clarify what my realm of what I handle is. But in terms of the structures in place, legislatures are often divided into issue-based committees that focused on issue-based legislation. So there are two relevant committees in the Senate. One is called the Codes Committee, which deals with the criminal and civil code. And another one is the Crime and Victims and Correction Committee, which deals with legislation around those three things. So there's those, and then also, you know, the chairs of those committees might hold hearings around legislation in which various stakeholders can talk about their difficulties. So for example, going back to Clean Slate, which I mentioned earlier, which would expunge records to, you know, give people a second chance after being formerly incarcerated without having that record following them. There was a hearing held where we had a chance to listen to stakeholders from all sides of the spectrum. So we heard from district attorneys and their position on it, police officers and their position on it, to formerly incarcerated people and their position, or the families of formerly incarcerated people and their position on it. So so the hearings are structured, and so are their committees. And I hope that answers the question.
I think, well, I in my opinion, it does, but, oh, sorry. Okay, they've just said that their question is more about understanding problems faced by police. So I'm,
Sure, yeah, I do. I am on the listserv for several correctional officers unions around the state, and I get updates from them about their experiences. They are also, you know, when we are moving legislation through the legislature, we get what are known as memos of support or memos of opposition, which are letters from community groups, nonprofit stakeholders, and I've seen the statements issued by correctional officers against certain pieces of legislation. And then again, also in the hearings, you know, I do get a chance to hear from the viewpoint of police officers. And, you know, I'm not saying I always agree, but there are structures in place to hear from them.
thank you. This one is about the state liquor authority and a recent prohibition of to-go cocktails in bars, selling bottles of wine and liquor. So this adjustment to prior regulations is what enabled so many bars to survive. What are the odds that New York's legislature will at least allow those sales to continue through Labor Day the survival of these local businesses is not a sure thing? That's the question.
Yeah, that's really troubling. And that's one where I'm just gonna put the blame on the governor for just, and lifting the state of emergency and ending, that lifeline for a lot of small businesses with really no grace period and not much warning. There was a piece of legislation to make it permanent, which did not come to a vote. And, unfortunately, the legislative session ended on June 10th. In the past, historically, we have come back for special sessions to pass emergency legislation. We actually did it last December to extend the eviction moratorium. And in emergencies, we have come back. So there's always a possibility we may come back for a special session in which legislation can be passed, including potentially extending this allowance to, sell to go alcohol or potentially make it permanent. But if you ask for the odds, I don't think I have an estimate of if they're likely or unlikely for you.
Thank you for that. So we are coming to our closing few moments. I just want to come back. There were two things that I wanted to touch on quickly before I ask the last question from the audience, which I'll leave that one for a little bit. I'll make that one a little more fun. So Johanna, I'll just come back to you quickly just on that last question that I left you on about effective tactics in your line of work, ineffective or most effective tactics. Yeah.
It's a little difficult to answer that question because of my line of work. I'm a professor. I'm also the host of a morning show now. I'm also a member of my community, and I consider myself part of the left. I think our biggest challenge is really to explain the world and its problems and identify root causes of social problems. And that is something that the left in the United States has not really done, which is why we have neo-fascists and people believing in conspiracies and dismissing science, because there is an epic crisis that we might not be feeling individually, but the country and all of its races are experiencing a deep economic problem. Absent answers to that existential problem of survival in a country that promises riches, right? You have scapegoating, blaming your neighbor for your discontent and for your misery and for your fall from grace economically. So the biggest challenge for us, for me as a professor, is to understand and clearly explain the root causes of the problems before us, which are not small. They're epic. The Florida Keys will not survive, right? We've just read about this. We're bidding that adieu. We have a heat wave that's unprecedented across the country. We are facing environmental catastrophe. And we have a predatory capitalism that has restructured itself amidst crisis, amidst pandemic, literally buying off half of New York. Half of New York has been gentrified or is on the way to be gentrified by real estate capitalists. So, and then there's the problem of white supremacy and its longstanding grip on this society. There's the question of housing and land, right? These are big questions that require strategy. There was a question that wasn't, someone said, well, how is the transfer of wealth going to save us, given that it didn't work in the 60s? part of what the American left, and I can only, for now, speak about the American left. The American left has been beaten down to a pulp by government repression, such that organization, political organization, is looked down upon in this country by everyone. But the only way we're going to really transform society is by coming together in organization and identifying the strategy that can leverage the power necessary to challenge these massive forces before us. There's a lot of creativity and there's a lot of episodic uprising. But how do we harness that? Not within the existing established system, but how do we actually dream of a world which we all want? A world that's not unreconstructed, a world that's civilized. Like, we live in an uncivilized, capitalism is uncivilized. American capitalism, white supremacy, is predatory. It makes absolutely no sense. How do we actually achieve a much deeper transformation of society? We are thinking human beings. We're scientists, in fact. Every day, we need to apply science to the process of transforming society.
Thank you for all of that, and thank you for bringing that question in here, because I think it was marked as marked off to the side, but I thought that was important to note, because we're talking about how do we counter sort of these perceptions of things that have never actually been done before, right? Like, we haven't actually redistributed the massive amount of wealth in this country and seen what that would look like. So yeah, just to close out, I just want to thank you all so much. This has been really enjoyable for me, and I'm just grateful for all of your time. And the last question that I will ask you is a little easier. I'm going to ask you all to recommend a book. Johanna, sorry, I think we probably know which one you will recommend, which is fine. But
well,
yeah.
No.
Okay, go for it.
Well, first of all, my book is not just about the Young Lords. If you want to understand New York in the post-World War II period, it's about the economic and demographic transformation of the city. It's about the police. It's about the schools. It's about the ways in which the healthcare industry came to dominate economic life in New York. But I would recommend Loaded, the book Loaded by Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz. It's a disarming history of the Second Amendment. Really one of the most incredible books I've read. Short, a brilliant book that will help you understand the root causes of white supremacy in this country and its ties to an emerging capitalism and to slavery and to the Second Amendment. Loaded, a disarming history of the Second Amendment and the police, by Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz.
Thank you.
Tiny book.
Good. I
have a tiny book.
Yeah,
So,
go for it.
I actually facilitate a books club with another New York City organization called Corpus New York, and it's called Burning World, where we ask our burning questions about the books that we read once a month. But we will be having our book club meeting tomorrow for the book Tar Beach by Faith Ringgold. It's a very, very tiny book. It's also a picture book. It's a children's book, but still very beautiful. We're going to be having a discussion about it tomorrow night on Zoom from 7 to 8 p.m. So if anybody wants to join, it's like 15 pages at most. I can send you the info. Yes, I can.
I love that. I love Faith Ringgold. That's great. And Corpus is awesome. Shout out to Corpus.
Yeah.
Senator Brisport?
Sure. I'm just gonna recommend a book I purchased this weekend. Actually, it's called The Prince, and it's got our lovely governor's face on it, and it's written by a great political commentator named Ross Barkin. And I just want to go back to when I talked about clean slate, kind of just hiccuping and sputtering at the very end of the legislative session. There was a fatal flaw in the legislation, and we had to start going into what are known as three-way negotiations to fix it. And three-way means it's the Senate, the Assembly, and the governor. and they were unable to reach a consensus with the governor's office, because what many people don't know is that the governor has historically used many divide and conquer techniques and tons of tactics to divide people and stop progressive causes throughout New York for the past 10 years he's been in office. So if you want to get a hint at exposing some of what he's been doing in New York over the past 10 years, you can check out the prints.
Thank you all so much. And I don't know if I'm allowed to do this, but I'm going to give a recommendation to you, which is the autobiography of Ida B. Wells, which I read a couple months ago and has just given me a much appreciated perspective on the many ways in which media framing is important in this world and is often very damaging. So that is the end of our program. I thank you all for joining us. Thank you to the audience for your really incisive questions. And thank you to Johanna, Senator Brisport, and Zanat for giving us your time and your energy and your presence, and just, just for the work that you do. This was really, really great. So thank you all. I'll pass it back over to Marcia for the final closing remarks.
Oh boy. Well, I want to thank you all too. I want to thank you for your voices, and I want to thank you for your work. And I want to thank everybody for coming and remind you that we have many, many other programs. The Justice Initiatives, where they've been put in the chat, has a program next Thursday called Crime, Punishment, and Liberalism. The Center for Brooklyn History has a program on Wednesday night about reparations with Robin Rue Simmons, who was the alderwoman in Evanston, Illinois, and Marcia Chatelain from the Georgetown University. He served on the university's working group on slavery, memory, and reconciliation, and others. Please join us for more programs, and thank you all for coming, and thank you all. Kayla, Zanat, Johanna, Senator Brisport, this was an extraordinary conversation with so many takeaways. Good night, everybody. Have a great night.
Thank you.